Welcome to Let the Quran Speak. I'm Aisha, your host. As we continue our journey on understanding the principles of Islamic jurisprudence, let's focus our discussion today on Qiyas, or analogy. How does this play into developing and informing Islamic law? As usual, let's sit down with Dr. Shabir Ali to learn more. Welcome to the show, Dr. Shabir.
Pleasure to be on.
So we're doing what is the final principle on our principles of Islamic jurisprudence?
Yeah, not one principle, but it comes actually in a number of forms. But if we wanted to put it as one principle, we would say it's the overall use of reason to look at the final verdict in a ruling that has been arrived at through the standard principles that we have already covered. So let's say one looked into the Quran and found a ruling. Okay, so that's great. But then we have to see how does that ruling fit within the present realities. So whether it comes from the Quran or from a hadith, or whether it was arrived at through ijma by scholars over time, consensus rulings, or whether it is just an individual scholar's judgment on the issue, in the final analysis, we want to see how this is going to fit and play out in the actual scenario that we're dealing with here, the reality on the ground. Because we may have arrived at this ruling through the usual standard processes, and we might say, okay, we've done our duty, we've arrived at the ruling, we just said it the way we found it. But now we have to think about the application. Is it going to fit well and go down properly and represent Islam well? Like, is this going to be something beautiful in the end? Because Islam is something beautiful. But sometimes a ruling arrived at through classical means may not give you a beautiful result. It may actually result in something ugly. So scholars applied themselves to this in various ways. The Iraqi scholars, most notably Imam Abu Hanifa, arrived at the principle of istihsan, which in Arabic means seeking beauty. And so he would want to see that this ruling fits very well, and if it doesn't fit very well, if the result is not something pleasing, he would want to go back and see, did we miss something? Did we compare this wrong? Do we have to make a different qiyas here, and so on, and try to arrive at a better ruling so that we do not result in something ugly.
So just so I'm clear, is it that in any ruling you have to go through all 5 principles, or does it stop at, say, like you said earlier, if you find a ruling in the Quran and it's clear, then does it stop at that? Or do scholars with every ruling in the past, they went through every single step?
No, if they found, the steps are so interrelated, and the whole thing is already before you. It's like you cannot say, I didn't see this.
Yeah.
So if, it's not that you're going to, but systematically, if we're going through it systematically, if the answer is found in the Quran, that is determinative. It doesn't mean that you're not going to look at anything else. You may find that the hadith says something different, then you want to see how do these reconcile with each other. Did we miss something in our interpretation of the Quran? How do we incorporate what we understood from the Quran with what is present in the hadith? We still need to go through like the whole body of evidence, but in terms of the legal force, what has most force is what is found in the Quran, over and above what is found in any other source. But now, for the final analysis, does it fit well on the ground? So the Hanafi scholars approached it through this process of, as they said, istihsan, seeking that which is beautiful. Whereas the scholars from the Hijaz, most notably Imam Malik, came up with a different term. He thought of maslaha, or islah. He wanted to see what is suitable to human welfare, because you might have arrived at an understanding of a Quranic verse, and you say, okay, this is what the Quran is telling us to do. But if you apply it the way you understand it, let's say in a literal manner, would that actually produce a benefit that is known to be in accordance with the Quranic objectives on the whole? For example, one might say that, and scholars have said, that there are certain objectives of the Quran, its teachings and legislation. The objective may be to preserve life, to preserve the intellect, to preserve progeny, to preserve faith, and to preserve or the wealth of people. So the rules are given like this. So rule against theft to preserve the properties of people, rules against murder to preserve the life of people, and so on. So there is always a kind of an objective. Why is alcohol prohibited? To preserve the human intellect, because alcohol destroys the intellect, or at least covers the intellect for a temporary time until the person becomes sober. So the Islamic rules are to achieve certain objectives. So the objectives are what is more important than the rules themselves. So now if we're looking at a particular rule in the Quran and it seems contrary to one of these objectives, and not necessarily only these objectives, but other Quranic objectives on the whole, then we might want to say, well, it doesn't look like the Quran actually means that in this particular place, because the Quran would not go against its overall objectives in giving a particular ruling. So our understanding of that ruling may be wrong, or maybe the Quran said it as a kind of a command, but it doesn't really mean a command, and so on. So some reasoning has to be applied here before we apply the law on the ground.
So I'm going to ask you, can you give us an example?
Well, actually, there are many examples that scholars have come up with. For example, they say that if a man were to utter divorce in the last stage of his life, in what they call marad al-maut, the sickness that leads to death. So he's a person who doesn't hope to recover. He may have actually uttered divorce in order to deprive his wife of inheriting from him, which is a mean thing for him to do. And since Islam wants to preserve justice among people, it would be unfair for a man to do that. So even if he did that, we wouldn't regard his pronouncement as having any validity, and the woman would still be considered married for the purpose of receiving her due share of the inheritance. So,
but I guess that would be within that context, and you know that's why he's doing that, right? Versus someone who, I mean, for whatever reason, genuinely does that. Sort of, how do you differentiate? And
the point is that if we applied the literal rulings of the classical law, the woman would stand divorced.
Gotcha.
But we would say, okay, we're not going to allow the literal application of the law here because that will result in injustice, and Islam is about justice. That's one of the most major objectives of the Quranic rulings. So we cannot allow this to pass like this.
So how is this principle, applied in modern times today? Do you find that it's still sort of applied within our context today, or do you think scholarship has sort of moved away from it?
It is still being applied, but scholars tend to be more reticent in applying reason to Islamic rulings, and so only one has to see a situation in which scholars feel that they're forced into something, and then that's when they give a new ruling. Otherwise, they just simply repeat the classical rulings. But there is more. There is more of the application of reason and common sense to applying Islamic ruling. One of the principles that Imam Shafi came up with is istidlal, or deduction. So you might deduce something from the standard sources, and that will have application to your modern context. But he also spoke about istishab, which means something like continuity, or putting two things together and consider them into some kind of a companionship. Because from sohba, which means companionship in Arabic, he gets this term, seeking that which is close. So based on that principle, we also have the idea of urf, or custom, which for Imam Shafi is important, meaning that if something is already customarily being done, then you don't need to change it unless there is something clear in the Quran or the life example of the Prophet, peace be upon him, that would give against that. So
customarily being done, like in society?
In society. So let's say Islam spreads into a new environment, and you find that in that environment people dress in a certain way. Now, you don't automatically try to change all of this, because now you go back to see, is this acceptable in some way? given what we know from the Quran and the life example of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So let's say Canadian styles of dressing. Now, it became an issue in where there's an already established Islamic society and people are dressing in a certain way that they know to be in conformity with Islamic principles. Now, if people in that society start to adopt like a Western form of dress, now that would be viewed with suspicion because it would look like they're not satisfied with that which is known to have grown out of the Islamic society, and they desire something else which is foreign and which seems to be associated with non-Muslim ideologies and so on. But now, let's say we come to invite Canadians to embrace the religion of Islam. Are we going to talk about their forms of dress? Well, not necessarily.
No.
We're going to look at the forms of dress and see how much of that is acceptable in some way in the Islamic ethos and how much of it is not. So obviously dresses that are quite revealing, pants that are too tight for men and so on.
So using your own Islamic principles, but then I guess complementing it and adopting it in a way that still aligns with your Islamic principles, but it's not completely contradictory in that way as well.
That's right. So we take what is there and what is customary as a given, and then we only modify what needs to be modified if necessary. And this also gives the idea of not only of urf and ada or custom and what is generally known, but also the idea of presumption. There is the presumption of a continuity of things. So let's say somebody is presumed to be innocent until proven guilty. That's a modern precept, right? But this already has been covered in Islamic law under this general heading of presuming what is there. In the more practical thing that affects every Muslim is that if you have made your ablutions before prayer, then you are in the state of purity. Unless you know for a fact that that state of purity has been breached by something specific, you are to presume that you still have that state of purity. So that's the idea of presumption. Presumption of innocence until proven guilty, presumption of purity until that purity is disrupted, once you know that the original state is purity. Presumption that things are permissible until they're proven to be haram or impermissible. So let's say, we want to eat some bananas. Well, we don't have to ask, well, is there a proof in the Quran and the Hadith that we can eat bananas? Well, it doesn't work that way. The way it works is to presume that bananas are permissible until you find the evidence that it is not permissible. So there's a presumption of the permissibility of things, except when it comes to meats, because in that case we would want to know if the meat is actually slaughtered by Islamic standards.
I think a very holistic conversation to a very complicated subject, so thank you very much, Dr. Shabir.
You're welcome.
Hey YouTube, we hope you benefited from this video. If you liked it, or if you didn't, let us know in the comments below. And if you're interested in learning more, check out some of our other videos. And don't forget to subscribe so you can get new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.